Okay, let's get started.
Are y'all ready for announcements?
Y'all ready for announcements?
We need somebody that can mud a little bit. We've got in the men's bathroom and on this sound booth wall, we need a little bit of mud done. And if anybody can do it, let Brother Stewart or I want to know. We've got sheetrock mud, and but we'll just, if anybody knows how to mud it, to fill in the cracks and spots, we'd appreciate that.
Yep.
I can grab a ball of mud outside and throw it on me.
That's not it.
Hey, we can mix it up and throw it.
What's the other announcement?
The storm is in Oklahoma, and Brother Chase said that we need to pray for Oklahoma. Shit, what did I say, Chase? Anyway, then, now I forgot oh. Brother Chris said to pray for Brother Dewey. He's not feeling.
Okay.
What kind of storm is in Oklahoma?
It's a severe storm. It's got hail.
And this church don't need it because it's got that
Yeah.
$25,000
Deductible, yeah. And I sound like I thought I just heard a little bit of thunder out there. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, then let's.
Last announcement.
Yes.
Please pray for me. I'll be expecting a child in September.
Ah.
You
I haven't named it. I'll find out the sex this week.
Well, you don't have to name it Harold. Okay. It's okay.
Especially if it's a girl.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be a great thing, yeah.
Maybe a middle name Lee. Maybe it'll be a
Oh,
She
okay.
just wants me to have twins so bad.
Uh,
And I reject that prophecy in the name of Jesus.
Hey, if it's already there, then
You
it's
do
coming.
that, it'll be triplets.
all right. Well, then let's open up. Pat, open us up.
Okay. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you. And Father, we pray and ask you of many things and all day long because we know that you hear us. Father, is a storm in Oklahoma. Father, I pray that you protect Oklahoma and all their neighbors, all those that serve you. But Father, also, don't let that storm come and do any damage here in Arkansas. And Father, I pray for that he be healed because, Father, he's dependent upon you to do this for him. Because, God, we want to give all the glory to you. And Father, as we study here tonight, and also Mandy with her 6 children or less that's coming, and Father, everything's going to be all right. And we just pray that you bless and anoint Brother Stewart as he teaches. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
That was the worst time to say that.
All right.
That was the worst time.
We're going to be in Numbers 9, chapter 9 tonight. We did number chapter, but when I was looking through it, chapter 7, basically it's telling about the gifts that the tribes brought to the tabernacle, which was just a whole lot of repeat stuff and a lot of it just didn't pertain to anything. It was just gifts that each of the tribes were supposed to bring. And then chapter 8 tells about the lighting of the lamps and the cleansing of the Levites for service, which we've already gone over several times in several other books, what they were supposed to bring, what they were supposed to do, and now they're just doing it, okay? Practically memorized. So that brings us to chapter 9. So let's look at verses 1 to 5. And the Lord spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, the 2nd year, after they were come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Let the children of Israel also keep the Passover at his appointed season. This month at even seasons, according to all the rites of it, and according to all the ceremonies thereof. The Passover, kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month at even in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all the Lord commanded Moses, so did the children of Israel. So Israel celebrated the first Passover just before they left Egypt, right? Okay, back in Exodus 12. Now, believe it or not, now it's 1 year later. All this stuff that we've been talking about has only been 1 year that they have been camped at Mount Sinai. So I mean, when you look at it and we've been going through it, it seems like they've been there for forever, but they've only been there 1 year. And this is the first. So God commanded Israel to keep the Passover a second time. Okay? Now, it's not a surprise for Israel to hear that the Passover had to be kept every year. All right? When it was first initiated, when God first put it out, he told Israel that they were going to keep it throughout all of their generations. Back in Exodus 12:14. The tabernacle was finished the first day of the first month of the second year. So all of this, the stuff that we've been talking about, we've got the idea that all of this stuff has already been going on and they've initiated it, they're doing all of this stuff, but the tabernacle is just now getting finished. So they're just now doing all of this stuff. Yes.
So as soon as the tabernacle is finished, it's the start of the
Yeah, they finished it on the first day of the first month of the second year. So that's when they finished it. And on this day, the cloud of glory covered the tabernacle. And about this time, the tribal leaders brought their gifts, which was covered in chapter, which were covered in chapter 8. And the long stay at the base of Mount Sinai was not a time of inactivity. Okay? That year that they have spent at the base of Mount Sinai, a lot of stuff went on. Man, it's been years, and it hasn't been. It's been 1 year, about as long as it's been taking us to actually go through this part and get to this point. That's how long it took them to get to this point. But they weren't doing nothing. They weren't just lounging around and saying, okay, we're just going to do it. No, they were getting everything ready. They were getting everything together. Now, Passover reminded Israel when God passed over his people. That was when Egypt's firstborn were judged in the last plague on Egypt, if you remember. But the blood of the lamb that applied to the doorposts of the home was seen by the angel of God's judgment, and seeing the blood, what happened? They knew not to go into that. Yeah, it was passed over. They spared the home because of the blood of the lamb. And Passover was kept as a continual reminder of this occasion of judgment and the deliverance from slavery that followed. Okay? To this day, the Jews still celebrate Passover. They do it every year. That's when Easter is. What we celebrate Easter is Passover for the Jewish people. As a matter of fact, what was the Last Supper? Anybody know? It was the Passover meal, yes. It was the Passover feast. Okay?
I was going to say right before his crucifixion.
Well, yeah, it was right before his crucifixion. but he was celebrating the Passover. And now, when you think of the Last Supper, what do you think of? Yeah, but what about the food? What about the food? What do you think about the food that was there at the Passover? Okay. Yeah, a lot of people think that, some people think, well, this is a big feast and everything was good. It was the Passover meal. It was the lamb, the bitters, all of the seder is what it was. That there's a bitter herb that they have to eat to remind them of the bitterness in Egypt. But it was the seder, is what they call it, and that's what Jesus and his disciples were celebrating at the time. That's what they were eating. It wasn't some big fancy all get together and, the waiters were coming in and bringing them a 50-course meal or anything like that. That's not what was happening. Yeah, it's not like our Thanksgiving. Okay? So, but it was the Passover meal. Now, Jesus fulfilled the Passover sacrifice by his death on the cross. His covering of blood causes the judgment of God that should be coming upon us to pass over his people. And we're commanded to continually remember this, just as the Jews continually remember their Passover meal, by remembering the work of Jesus on the cross and by remembering the Lord's Supper. Okay? Yes. Messianic Jews, yes, they still do the Passover. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Do they also do blood above the doorstep?
No, they don't do. They don't put the blood above put the blood doorposts on this. Yeah, well, they anoint it, but they don't put the blood on the doorpost right now. But they do have the same celebratory meal. Yes.
Did Jesus tell the disciples how to take communion when they were at the Last Supper?
No.
When was that he shared how that represented his body?
Well, he told them, "You do this in remembrance of me."
Was that at
You
the
know.
last meal?
Yeah, that was at the Last Supper. Okay, but it's like a lot of things that we have to be taught. They kind of instituted that, but Jesus told them, "Eat the bread, drink the wine. You do this in remembrance of me." Okay, so, but there's a lot of things that we do that it's kind of like, and we get a little off the on a rabbit trail and get off subject a little bit. It's kind of like praying. Uh, how did you learn how to pray?
Our Father who art in heaven,
Okay,
by the Bible.
okay. But is that how you pray? Is that all you pray?
I normally kind of talk to him like a friend.
Okay. But how did you learn to do that?
I learned it through witnessing people pray, and
Okay.
I adopted my own language.
Okay. All right. Very few Christians, if you ask them, can tell you, or when you do ask them, how did you learn how to pray? Watching somebody else, listening to somebody else, how they pray. Okay? But his apostles, the disciples, they asked Jesus, said, "Lord, teach us to pray just as John taught his disciples." Well, if there's not a way to pray, then why did they ask him to teach him how to pray? Okay? So that's where the Lord's Prayer comes in, and we're not going to get into that, but right now. But that's where the Lord's Prayer comes in. Is Jesus teaching them how to pray? The Lord's Prayer is a model prayer, the template of how you're supposed to pray. But it's just one of those things. It's a lot of things that we do in the Christian walk that we have just. Well, I learned it by watching somebody else, you know. Is that the way you do it? I don't know. That's the way everybody else does it, so that's the way I do it. Okay? But Israel was properly obedient to God, and we don't find significant disobedience against God or trust in God by Israel. It's only after that that we start seeing problems. They were doing what God commanded them to do, everything that God commanded them to do. They were doing it exactly as Moses told them to do it and how to do it. Okay? So they were being properly obedient to God, doing what God had told them to do. So while they were camped at Mount Sinai, they were doing what they were supposed to, okay? And they trusted God. All of this stuff was going on that first year. And it wasn't until after that they started moving away from Sinai that we start seeing any problems. But this makes their first distrust of God, when it did happen, a rebellion. Yeah, then they started having periods where where they would be disobedient, where they would be rebellious against them. And it was that they didn't trust God to do things for them. It's just like God had been providing them manna from heaven all of this time. And then, once they got to Mount Sinai, that was all cut off. And they had to rely on themselves to do this. But they've been trusting in God to do everything. And now, once they leave, now they started to distrust him. And that distrust was actually an act of rebellion against God. And even more shocking, it was without excuse. They didn't have an excuse to do it. Hey? Well, we see that today with a lot of more than just teens, with a lot of people, We say we trust in God. We don't trust in God. God do this. I trust God that God's gonna do this, and yet we go out and we try to do it ourselves. Yeah, when it doesn't happen, then we say, well, he's not gonna do it. It's one of those things to where we've seen what God can do. We've seen the works that he can do. We've seen all the great things that he can do, and yet we still distrust him that he's going to do it. No, that's just the rebellious nature of man. Because it doesn't happen when we want it to. I'm sorry, Jennifer, would you?
I said that's where faith comes in.
That's why you have to have faith. Yeah. But from Numbers 11 on, they started to rebel against God. They started to have disobedience towards him. Okay? Now let's look at verses 6 to 14. And there were certain men who were defiled by the dead body of a man, that they could not keep the Passover on that day. And they came before Moses and before Aaron on that day. And those men said unto him, we are defiled by the dead body of a man. Wherefore we are kept back, that we may not offer an offering of the Lord in his appointed season among the children of Israel. And Moses said unto them, stand still, and I will hear what the Lord will command concerning you. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, if any man of you or of your posterity shall be unclean by reason of a dead body, or be in a journey afar off, yet he shall keep the Passover unto the Lord. The 14th day of the second month, at evening they shall keep it, and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And they shall leave none of it unto the morning, nor break any bone of it. According to all the ordinances of the Passover they shall keep it. But the man that is clean and is not in a journey, and forbeareth to keep the Passover, even the same soul shall be cut off from among his people, because he brought not the offering of the Lord in his appointed season. That man shall bear his sin. And if a stranger shall sojourn among you, and will keep the Passover unto the Lord according to the ordinances of the Passover, and according to the manner thereof, so shall he do. Ye shall have one ordinance both for the stranger and for him that was born in the land. So this was an attempt to resolve two principles here. The first was that every Israelite must obey the Passover. Wasn't a choice. Wasn't a, man, well, yeah, I want to celebrate this holiday. No, I don't want to celebrate. No, you didn't have a choice. You had to celebrate. Every Israelite was required to celebrate the Passover. Okay? Every Israelite must be included in that Passover. The second principle was that no one in a state of ritual uncleanness could take part in the normal religious life of the community. Okay? Right? Everybody has to, all Israelites have to obey this. They have to be included in the Passover. But if you're unclean, ceremonially unclean, you can't participate in the religious ceremonies. So, what are we going to do here? Okay? Now we got a problem. And God had to address this. Right? We're going to talk about what's going to happen. Okay? Now, these outward external symbols of uncleanness were important and they could not be ignored, because these outward signs of uncleanness reminded Israel of their inward uncleanness. These certain men, the only ones in Israel who had defiled themselves right before the Passover. Just the two that came in to ask about it. And it's not like they didn't want to. These guys wanted to keep the Passover. They wanted to do what they were supposed to do. But these two guys were bold enough to ask Moses and to ask God through Moses for an exemption to the previous command. In other words, they're saying, look, yeah, I know we're unclean, we're ceremonially unclean, but we want to, and we're required to celebrate the Passover, to participate in the Passover. So can we make an exemption for the Passover that we can do this? Now Moses, he says, okay, that's a good question. And I'm going to have to ask God about it. And I need God's wisdom to resolve these principles. So it wasn't good to exclude people from keeping the Passover. But it also wasn't good to disrespect God's holiness for participating in religious ceremonies when they were unclean. By allowing the ceremonial unclean to participate, that would have disrespected God. And to this point, God hadn't said anything about that. God says if you're unclean, you can't celebrate, you can't do the ceremonial things because you're ceremonial unclean. And you have to wait this period of time and do this and do this and do this to become clean once again, and then you can go back to doing it. But, there's certain things you can do. This wasn't like sacrifice to where they were constantly sacrificing. Passover happened once a year. And they're going, look, we want to celebrate the Passover. We want to participate in the Passover. So, God needed to seek God about it. Needed to ask him to clarify things. And God told Moses that those unclean at Passover, if they had been defiled at Passover, or if they were away, if they were sojourned off on a journey, that they were far away from the land, right? Not so much on vacation because they didn't take vacation, but they were away on a journey of some sort, okay? But they could still keep the feast, but they just had to do it 1 month later.
And is that the verse
that they had to follow the same ordinance, but they just did it a month later. Okay? So instead of doing it on Passover, I'd say, okay, instead of the 14th of the first month, the 14th of the second month. You do that. That gives you a month to become ceremonially clean once again. Get back from your journey, whatever it is. So you can still do Passover, you just do it a month later. Right? So God gave them the opportunity to do it. So this solution made keeping the Passover possible for everybody, right? And yet still respected God's holiness. The principle of ritual for the unclean to remember God's spared judgment and deliverance. Okay? And the unclean were among those who they need to remember what God did for his people through the Passover. However, those among Israel who were clean and not traveling had to keep the Passover on the day that it was supposed to happen. Okay? If they didn't, they would be cut off from the people. In other words, if you skipped out on that on celebrating Passover or observing Passover, then they kicked you out of the camp. You were separated from the people. Okay? So the punishment for not keeping Passover was severe. The thing is, that person had to bear his own sins instead of having their sin borne by the Passover lamb. We have to partake of Jesus. We have to partake of his grace and mercy, or we will bear our own sins. Jesus is the only way. Jesus is the Passover lamb. He's the only way that we can transfer our sins to the Passover lamb, to him. Okay? Otherwise, we have to bear those sins ourselves. Additionally, it didn't matter what bloodline or ethnic group the person came from. Even the strangers in Israel could and must keep the Passover, or they too would be cut off. Okay? A Jew with the purest bloodline. Everybody in their family was Jew. They've been Jewish their whole life. You know, they're all the way down their bloodline. It's always been Jewish. Right? There's no Gentile in the wood pile anywhere. They're all Jewish. Right? They would be cut off if they neglected Passover. But a Gentile stranger would be accepted. How important it was? Even the purest Jew had to, if he didn't observe Passover, he was out of there. And a Gentile stranger, once he observed Passover, he was accepted. Okay? However, the Gentile visitor had to come under the law of the God of Israel. Right? So basically, it's just like right now. Some people think that you have to be born a Jew in order to be a Jew, to be Jewish. Okay? You can convert to Judaism. But when you convert to Judaism, you have to fall under the law. You have to do what the law says to do. Okay? And Exodus 12:48 requires that those from outside Israel could keep the Passover if they were first circumcised. Now, the second Passover had to be kept according to the same rite and the same ceremony as a formal feast. The meal and the ritual had to be the same. Basically, the same as it was the very first one. Okay? All right, verse number 15. On the day that the tabernacle was reared up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, namely the tent of the testimony, and at even there was upon the tabernacle as it were the appearance of fire until the morning. So when the tabernacle was originally built, it by showing his presence. Okay? Yes, that was in the form of the cloud by day and fire. This cloud is what we refer to as the Shekinah glory of God. Okay? The cloud came in by day and it was fire by night. And they had, so the people of Israel could constantly see that God was there in the tabernacle. Right? Now, it was evident in different times in history. For example, when Solomon built the first temple, the cloud of glory filled the temple, the Shekinah glory. When Israel had completely turned away from God, and before the temple was destroyed by the conquering Babylonians, the cloud of glory disappeared. God withdrew his glory. Okay? But these signs were more than the visible assurance of God's presence. The cloud by day and the fire by night were also helps and comforts to Israel. Okay? The fire at night was a comfort to Israel amid the darkness in the wilderness. And the cloud by day was a shade from the hot wilderness sun. Now, the idea of God's presence as a protective shade like this is repeated in other places in the Bible as well. Isaiah 25:4 talks about it. Psalms 121, 5 and 6 talks about it, about God's glory, God's cloud being a shade to people. Okay? All right, verses 16 to 23. So it was, the cloud covered it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. And when the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, and then after that the children of Israel journeyed. And in the place where the cloud abode, there the children of Israel pitched their tents. And the commandment of the Lord, at the commandment of the Lord, the children of Israel journeyed, and at the commandment of the Lord they pitched. As long as the cloud abode upon the tabernacle, they rested in their tents. And when the cloud tarried long upon the tabernacle many days, then the children of Israel kept the charge of the Lord and journeyed not. And so it was, when the cloud was a few days upon the tabernacle, according to the commandment of the Lord, they abode in their tents, and according to the commandment of the Lord they journeyed. And so it was, when the cloud abode from even until the morning, and that the cloud was taken up in the morning, that they journeyed, whether it was by day or by night that the cloud was taken up, they journeyed. Or whether it were 2 days or a month or a year that the cloud tarried upon the tabernacle, remaining thereon, the children of Israel abode in their tents and journeyed not. But when it was taken up, they journeyed. At the commandment of the Lord they rested in their tents, and at the commandment of the Lord they journeyed. They kept the charge of the Lord and the commandment of the Lord by the hand of Moses. Now, even though Israel had been organized and ordered by God, cleansed, set apart, they were generous in giving and walking according to their priesthood, they still had to be guided by God every single step of the way. Okay? That was the only way they were going to make it to the promised land of Canaan. God didn't do all of those previous things that God did to make them to be able to march towards the promised land without him. He did all of those things so they could take him with them, but to make every step in constant dependence on him. So basically, when the cloud moved, Israel moved. Okay? Whenever the cloud took off, they followed the cloud. Okay? When the cloud stayed, they stayed. If the cloud stayed one day, they stayed one day. If the cloud stayed a month, they stayed a month. And it wasn't until the cloud was taken up that they left. Taken up at night. If the cloud was taken up by night, they'd say, okay, I guess we're packing up and leaving now. Whenever the cloud, God's glory left on that, they followed the cloud. Right? They only went where the presence of God led them. And they only stayed where the presence of God stayed. Now, in a similar way, believers must be led by the presence of God. Colossians 3:15 says, "Let the peace of God rule in your hearts." What this means is let the presence of God's peace be an umpire or a judge in our hearts and in our lives. Okay? Now, as I said, the movement of the cloud was unpredictable. They didn't know when it was going to happen. And God would not allow Israel to be led by routine or tradition. They had to see and to respond to the presence of God. It was only with his presence could they go, and it was only when his presence was there could they stay. All right? That takes us to the end of chapter 9. We're going to get in a little bit to chapter 10 tonight. Talk about some of the trumpets that they made. This is kind of interesting. So we'll get into a little bit of it tonight, not all of it. And the Lord spake, verses 1 and 2, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Make thee 2 trumpets of silver, of a whole piece shalt thou make them, that thou mayest use them for the calling of the assembly and for the journeying of the camps. So the 2 silver trumpets were used to direct the movement of the camps. For marching, for battle, to gather the nation together for an assembly. Okay? The silver trumpets are distinct from the ram's horn. Now these instruments, these silver trumpets were about 2 feet long. They were a very narrow tube, and they were blown in certain patterns. And they emitted a bright and a piercing sound that would clearly communicate to the people their desired intent. Now, I don't know if you've, I'm sure you've all seen movies about Civil War or different, old-time wars, and before they had radios and all this other stuff. Okay? The trumpet, whoever the trumpeter was, would sound his horn, and there were different sounds that they would make for people to do certain things. All right? That's still used a lot today, not to direct troops or anything like that, but in military life now, there are 2 things that are very traditional to do that involve the trumpet. The first one is Reveille, start of the day. Reveille starts today. That's when you get up. That's when everything's going. The day is ended when they sound retreat. Okay? And if you've never been on a military base at retreat, it is an experience, okay? Because, and I've had civilians that are going, what are these nuts doing? Because retreat starts to sound everything stops on the base. Yeah, that's when you bring the flag down and everything stops. Everything stops. Nobody moves. The cars stop, everything stops. Okay? And you turn towards wherever the base flag is at. Right? It was really funny because we were doing a golf tournament at Fort Hood a few months ago. And we're out on the golf course in the middle of playing around. We're out on the, and all of a sudden, retreat. Everybody on the golf course stops and goes, "Where's the flag at? Where's the flag?" And everybody stops and we turn towards the flag and wait for a retreat to sound. Okay? That's just what you did. Everybody stops at retreat. All right? Now, on our base, when I was on our base, they would sound retreat, then they would play the national anthem, and then they would blow taps. And that was the end of the day. Okay? I don't think they blow taps anymore at the end of the day. But that just signified the end of the work day. Okay? So, but it's not the end of the Yeah, that was end of the admin day. You know, the administration got to go home after that, but not the rest of us. But also, you'll see a lot of yes.
Was there an unspoken rule back in the day when there were wars and there were people in the military that only played an instrument? Like, we're not going to kill that person. They don't even have.
Mm-mm. No, they'd still kill that person. Matter of fact, that was one of the trumpet player was the one. The trumpet player and the flag bearer, those are the ones that got shot first. You know, because if you kill the trumpet player, they can't communicate. Eh? And if they kill the flag bearer, you can't see who's who.
That's when the second chair trumpet player
Mm-hmm.
comes on.
Yep. Yeah. But I think they still do it now in the Navy, and Sister Jen can tell me whether it's true or not, but when you go aboard, a lot of times they'll pipe you aboard. Do they still pipe people aboard?
Only if they're like
Officers or something? Yeah, somebody important gets piped aboard, or they're making.
Or actually, like, they did it too when, like, one of us was done, like, like, if we were, like, leaving for good,
Uh-huh.
they take you over the ship.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It's been more than a day that
But I think they still do now whenever the captain wants to make an announcement or something, he'll tell the whoever it is to get the chief or whoever it is to pipe it, and they'll and then that means that there's an announcement. So that's just so we still used similar. But that's what they were doing is they used these trumpets, these silver trumpets, to tell people to do certain things. Because they didn't have cell phones. They didn't have mass text. You couldn't call everybody and put everybody on FaceTime and say, okay, you didn't broadcast it on the radio or television. There wasn't all that stuff. The only way you could get the word out was through these trumpets, okay? Yeah, they were a few thousand years away for that. But the silver trumpets were distinct and distinctly different than the ram's horns. The ram's horn is called the shofar. It is the shofar that is used to announce the Day of Atonement. That is what the priests were blowing at Jericho as they marched around. Okay? So the trumpet were helpful tools. And it was a tool. Okay? And they needed this for their journey to the promised land. Without them, it'd be difficult to assemble the nation. It would be difficult for them to get everybody to march towards Canaan. Okay? And before we can obey God, we first have to give Him our attention. And the trumpets were used to get the attention of the people of God. Okay? All right, verses 3 to 10. And when they shall blow with them, all the assembly shall assemble themselves to thee at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And if they blow but with one trumpet, then the princes, which are heads of the thousands of Israel, shall gather themselves unto thee. And when you blow an alarm, the camps that lie on the east parts shall go forward. When you blow an alarm the second time, the camps that lie on the south side shall take their journey and shall blow an alarm for their journey. But when the congregation is to be gathered together, ye shall blow, but ye shall not sound an alarm. And the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall blow with the trumpets, and they shall be to you for an ordinance forever throughout your generations. And if ye go to war in your land against the enemy that oppresseth you, then ye shall blow an alarm with the trumpets, and ye shall be remembered for the Lord your God, and ye shall be saved from your enemies. Also in the day of your gladness, and in your solemn days, and in the beginnings of your months, ye shall blow with the trumpets over your burnt offerings, over the sacrifices of your peace offerings, that they may be to you for a memorial before your God. I am the Lord your God. Okay? So again, distinctive sounds were made to indicate different things. Gatherings or assemblies, whether they wanted to march, the people to march. Israel heard the trumpets, and they gathered as they were directed to do. Right? God also promised to hear the trumpet of Israel in warfare. And when he heard the trumpets during war, he would act on behalf of the nation. Right? So they still use those today in Israel. They use the silver trumpets. They also use the shofar. The shofar is used to call people to prayer at different times, and Islam does it too. But the shofar is done to call people into prayer, to call people to worship. In the synagogues, they use them. Okay? And the trumpet, I'm sure, is the same way because it didn't have the little valves on them that you can move, or a little slide to make different tones on it and everything. So you had to make all the tones yourself. So in a sense, God heard the trumpet, responded to his people in their need. Okay? And trumpets were also used in a way of celebrating the gathering of God's people and the presence of the Lord with them. God will use the sound of a trumpet to gather his people at the ultimate assembling together. Okay? The catching away of the church. To meet the Lord in the air, remember that? 1 Thessalonians 4:16 to 18. It says he will descend with the sound of a trump. Okay? Not the sound of Donald Trump, but the sound of a trumpet. Okay? Yes.
I feel like this was like a lot easier to get everybody together instead of having one person try to yell.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Lot more effective. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it carries a lot better than the voice, and even today, on when they blow the shofar for a call to worship, they face the east, then the north, then the south, or then the west, and then the south. So they turn, all four directions, blowing the shofar to let people know that, so everybody from all directions can hear. Right? Now, in many ways, the nature of the use of these silver, the nature and the practice of preaching. Okay? There was value in a variety of trumpets and tones. Okay? The trumpet requires effort to make the sound, right? You have to do it yourself. You have to, you do certain things with your lips and got to raise your voice and everything like that to make it work on that. And I tried blowing a trumpet one time and it made my lips tickle too much, so I couldn't do it. So
Yeah, the band director, he's like, so people, they'll be really limpy when they're playing the instrument, and he's like, use air.
yeah, just like preaching, the trumpet requires an effort to make the sound. And just like preaching, the sound should be made clear. And the sound should be loud enough to be heard. And if the sound continues too long, it just became a bunch of noise. All right? If a preacher, and I know some of you look at me and going, remember that. Remember that Sunday, okay? Yeah. The trumpet could not make many different sounds because it didn't have the valves or the slides or anything like that. And when you've got those valves and those slides, you can do different things with it. But since it didn't, you were limited to the sounds that you can make. All right? Yeah, that's it. But the sound gathers the people of God, just like preaching. The sound leads the people of God forward. The trumpets were to get the attention of the people, just like preaching, okay? And the people were supposed to respond to the sound of the trumpet, just like people should respond to preaching. The trumpets were to instruct and to guide people. Isn't that what we're supposed to do when we preach? All right? The trumpets sometimes just called the leaders. Okay? The sound also tells people of glad news. And it leads the The trumpet was to sound an alarm, just like preaching is supposed to be. And the sound comes from an instrument shaped by hammering and hard impact. I tell you what, preachers are shaped by hammering and hard impact. All right? This is very important. The sound is heard by God Himself. Okay? And the sound was made by someone who is called, who was cleansed, who was sanctified, and who is anointed. The sound had a special significance to the people of God. The sound proclaimed the work of the atoning sacrifice. The sound celebrated peace with God and a right relationship with Him. The trumpets only work effectively with the evidence of God's presence. That's the only time that they were effective. It's the same way with preaching. The only way preaching is effective is with God's presence. It's there. Okay? And we're going to end it right there. Get into the rest of it next week in chapter 10. Any questions, comments?
Thank you for joining us today.